I was crying when I dropped my keys in that underground parking garage, and somehow he knew exactly where they'd land before they even hit the concrete. I know that sounds impossible, but I swear to you, the second those keys slipped from my shaking fingers, this man I'd never seen before was already moving toward the spot where they clattered against the cold floor. Like he'd been waiting for that exact moment. Like he'd been waiting for me. It was 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in December, and I was falling apart in the parking garage beneath my Denver apartment building. My presentation was in 43 minutes, my mascara was streaked down my cheeks, and my entire life felt like it was unraveling faster than I could catch the pieces. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in this sickly yellow glow that made the concrete walls feel like they were closing in on me. Before I continue this, hit that subscribe button. I post one real story every single day. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I'm always curious who my stories are reaching. The morning had started like any other disaster. My alarm didn't go off because apparently my phone had died sometime during the night, despite being plugged in. My coffee maker decided to die with a sad little wheeze and a puff of smoke that made my entire kitchen smell like burned plastic. The presentation I'd been working on for weeks, the one that could make or break my career, somehow corrupted overnight, leaving me with nothing but a blank document and 3 hours of panic-induced recovery work. By the time I stumbled down to the parking garage, clutching my laptop bag and a travel mug full of gas station coffee that tasted like regret, I was already 27 minutes late and barely holding it together. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip my car keys, and that's when I saw him. He was leaning against a black pickup truck about 3 spaces away from my beat-up Honda, and something about the way he stood there made me pause mid-breakdown. He wasn't checking his phone like everyone else in the world. He wasn't tapping his foot or looking impatient. He was just standing there with this quiet stillness that felt completely out of place in a world that never stops moving. He looked like he was in his early 40s, maybe 43 or 44. Tall, probably 6'2" or 6'3", wearing a charcoal gray wool coat that looked expensive but lived in, like he'd had it for years, and it had molded to fit him perfectly. Dark hair with just enough silver threading through it at the temples to make you wonder about all the stories that had put it there. Strong jawline, broad shoulders, hands that looked like they knew how to fix things. But it was his eyes that stopped me cold when he looked up and met my gaze across that parking garage. They were the kind of deep brown that reminded you of coffee on winter mornings, rich and warm and complicated. And when they focused on me, standing there in my wrinkled blazer with mascara tracks down my cheeks, I felt something shift in my chest. Something I hadn't felt in, God, maybe ever. Like recognition, but for someone I'd never met. I tried to pull myself together, to at least look like I had some semblance of control over my life, but I was fumbling with my purse, trying to find my keys while balancing my laptop bag and that awful coffee, and my hands just wouldn't stop shaking. That's when everything exploded. My purse strap caught on my laptop bag, jerking my arm at the wrong angle. Papers scattered across the concrete like confetti, printouts of my presentation, business cards, receipts, all the detritus of a life barely held together. My phone skittered across the floor, making a sound that definitely meant a cracked screen. And my keys, those stupid, essential keys, went flying in a perfect arc through the air. That's when he moved. Not rushed, not dramatic, just this fluid, certain movement like he'd been choreographing this moment his entire life. By the time I looked up from where I was crouched on the cold concrete, gathering the scattered pieces of my dignity, he was already there, already holding my keys in his large, careful hands. "These yours." His voice was deeper than I expected, with this rough edge around the vowels that made me think of whiskey and late nights and conversations that mattered. "Thank you." I stood up slowly, and suddenly we were close enough that I could smell his cologne, something clean and warm with hints of cedar that made me want to step closer instead of backing away like a normal, sensible person would. "I'm such a complete mess this morning." He handed me the keys, and when our fingers brushed, just for a second, just skin against skin, I swear the temperature in that garage went up 10 degrees. There was this moment, this pause, where neither of us moved our hands away, and I could feel my heart doing something arrhythmic in my chest. We all have those days, he said, but there was something in his voice, something weighted and knowing that made me think he was talking about more than just dropping keys in parking garages. I'm late for the most important presentation of my career, I found myself saying, even though I had absolutely no idea why I was telling this complete stranger my problems. There was just something about him, something that made me want to keep talking. Everything that could possibly go wrong has gone wrong. It's like the universe is conspiring against me. He was quiet for a moment, studying my face with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. His eyes moved over my features like he was memorizing them, like he was trying to solve some puzzle I didn't know I represented. What's the presentation about? Sustainable urban development. The words tumbled out of me. I'm pitching to the city council about converting abandoned lots into community gardens. Food deserts, environmental justice, building community connections. I laughed, but it came out shaky and uncertain. Sounds pretty naive when I say it like that, doesn't it? No, he said immediately, firmly, like my question had personally offended him. It doesn't sound naive at all. The way he said it, so certain, so immediate, without even a second of hesitation, made something warm and unfamiliar bloom in my chest. When was the last time someone had believed in something I cared about without needing to be convinced? I'm Maya, I said, extending my hand. David. He took my hand in his, and his grip was warm and solid and steady. He paused, like he was deciding whether to say something else. And for what it's worth, you don't look like a mess. I've been crying in a parking garage. I've seen worse places to cry. There was something in his tone, something that made me look at him more carefully. He had this quality about him, like he was carrying something heavy, but had learned how to make it look effortless. Like he'd done his own share of crying in worse places than parking garages. Are you okay? I asked, and I meant it. Really meant it, in a way that surprised me. He smiled then, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Complex and a little sad and entirely too knowing. That's a complicated question. Most of the good ones are. We stood there for a moment, neither of us moving, and I realized I didn't want to leave. Which was completely insane, because I was already catastrophically late, and I didn't know this man from anyone. And there were approximately 1,000 reasons why I should just say thank you and get in my car and drive to the most important meeting of my professional life. But something about the way he was looking at me, like he was seeing something he hadn't expected to find, like I was the answer to a question he'd forgotten he'd asked, made me want to stay right there in that ugly parking garage forever. You should go, he said finally, but he didn't sound like he wanted me to. Your presentation. Right. I clutched my keys tighter, feeling the metal edges bite into my palm. Thank you. For the keys, I mean. For helping. Maya. He said my name like he was testing how it felt in his mouth, rolling it around like wine he wanted to savor. Good luck today. I made it halfway to my car before I turned around. He was still standing there, still watching me, and something about his expression, longing mixed with resignation, made my heart skip and stumble. David? I called across the garage, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. Yeah. Are you going to be okay? Another one of those complicated smiles, the kind that held entire conversations I wasn't privy to. Ask me tomorrow. I drove to my presentation thinking about the way he'd said my name, the way his fingers had felt against mine, the way he'd looked at me like I was something precious and unexpected, the way his voice had gone rough around the edges when he'd told me good luck, like the words meant more than they should have. The presentation went better than I could have possibly hoped. The city council not only approved my proposal, they approved it with enthusiasm. 3 local businesses offered to sponsor the project on the spot. My boss pulled me aside afterward to hint at a promotion, additional funding, expanded scope. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd dreamed about, was suddenly within reach. I should have been ecstatic. I should have been calling my mom, my best friend, posting celebratory selfies on Instagram. Instead, I kept thinking about David. About the way he'd moved to catch my keys like he'd been expecting them to fall. About the sadness behind his smile. About the way he'd said, ask me tomorrow, like he wasn't entirely sure there would be a tomorrow worth asking about. By 5 o'clock, I couldn't stand it anymore. I drove back to my apartment building and took the elevator down to the parking garage, half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. Half convinced he'd been some kind of stress-induced hallucination brought on by too much caffeine and not enough sleep. But he was there. Same spot, same black pickup truck, but now he was sitting on the tailgate with a cup of coffee in his hands, staring at nothing in particular. He looked tired in a way that went deeper than just needing sleep, and when he saw me walking toward him, something in his expression shifted from resigned to surprise to something that might have been relief. "How did the presentation go?" he asked, like he'd been waiting all day to find out. "You waited." It wasn't a question. I could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way he'd positioned himself so he'd have a clear view of the elevator doors. "I waited." "Why?" He looked at me for a long moment, and I watched him make some kind of decision behind those coffee brown eyes. "You reminded me of something." "What?" "Why I stayed." I moved closer, close enough to see the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried more weight than they should have to, close enough to notice the duffel bag in the bed of his truck, the cardboard boxes stacked behind the cab. "Where were you going to go?" "Colorado Springs." "Maybe further south." "Arizona, New Mexico." He took a sip of his coffee and stared at the concrete wall across from us. I had my truck packed, my apartment keys sitting on the kitchen counter, and a full tank of gas. I was going to disappear. My heart clenched, actually clenched, like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed. "What changed?" "You dropped your keys." I stared at him. "That's it. That's it." He set down his coffee and looked at me directly, and I saw something raw and honest in his expression that made my breath catch. "I've been divorced for 2 years. Lost my job 6 months ago when the construction company I worked for went under. My dad died in September, and I spent the last 3 months settling his estate and realizing I don't have much left here that matters anymore." "David." I was walking to my truck this morning, ready to just leave. Start over somewhere else, someone else. And then I saw you." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "You were crying in a parking garage, and your whole world was falling apart, but you were still fighting. Still trying. And something about that, something about the way you looked, lost, but not defeated, reminded me what it felt like to care about something. What would you do if you were in my place? Tell me in the comments." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to run, because this was too much, too intense, too fast. We were strangers talking about life-changing decisions in a parking garage, and that wasn't how these things were supposed to work. But a bigger part of me wanted to step closer, to reach out and touch his face, to tell him he didn't have to disappear just because everything hurt. "So you stayed because of me?" "I stayed because you reminded me that some things are worth staying for." "But you don't even know me." "No," he agreed. "I don't. But you asked if I was going to be okay, and you meant it. And I realized I wanted to find out the answer to that question. I wanted to stick around long enough to see what happened next." We looked at each other across the small space between us, and I felt something shift, something that felt like the beginning of everything important. "I got the project approved," I said quietly. "I figured you would." "How could you possibly know that?" "The way you talked about it. Like it mattered more than just getting the job done. Like you actually gave a damn about making things better." He smiled, and this time it was real, reaching all the way to his eyes. "People like that usually find a way to make things work. It does matter." I stepped closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "I want to build something that lasts. Something that makes a difference." "So do I." The words hung between us, heavy with meaning, and I knew we weren't just talking about gardens and construction projects anymore. "David." "Yeah. I'm glad you stayed." He smiled then, really smiled, and it transformed his entire face. Made him look younger, lighter, like someone had lifted a weight he'd been carrying for too long. "So am I." "Would you?" I took a breath, feeling like I was standing at the edge of something that could change everything. "Would you like to get dinner? I know this place that makes the best green chili in Denver. Nothing fancy, but it's warm and the food's good, and..." "I'd like that," he said, cutting off my nervous rambling. "I'd like that a lot." "Good." I pulled out my phone, grateful that the screen had only cracked a little. "Can I have your number?" "Maya?" He was looking at me with that same intensity from this morning, but now there was something else there too. Something warm and hopeful and real. Yeah, thank you. For what? For dropping your keys. I laughed, and it felt like the first real laugh I'd had in months. Bright and surprised and full of possibility. Thank you for picking them up. Anytime. We exchanged numbers, made plans for dinner the next night, and I started walking back toward the elevator. But when I got there, I turned around one more time. David? Yeah? Tomorrow, when I ask if you're okay, what are you going to say? He was quiet for a moment, and I watched him think about it, really consider the question like it mattered. Like the answer mattered. Ask me tomorrow, he said finally. But I think the answer might be yes. I smiled. I'll hold you to that. The elevator doors closed, and I rode up to my apartment with my heart beating faster than it had in years. I'd started the day thinking everything was falling apart, that the universe was conspiring against me. Instead, I'd ended it feeling like maybe, just maybe, everything was finally falling into place exactly the way it was supposed to. Before I go, thank you. These stories are real. They're mine. And I share one every day. If you want to hear more, subscribe. That was 10 months ago. David and I have dinner every Tuesday now, in the same little restaurant where we had our first date. He never did leave Denver. He started his own contracting business, and guess who his first client was? We're breaking ground on the first community garden next month, and he's designing the raised beds, the tool shed, the whole infrastructure that's going to make my dream a reality. Every morning when I go down to the parking garage, he's there waiting by his truck with coffee for both of us, the good kind, not gas station swill. And every morning I'm reminded that sometimes the most important moments in our lives happen when we're not looking for them at all. Sometimes they happen when we're crying in parking garages, when everything's going wrong, when we think we're completely alone. Sometimes all it takes is dropping your keys for someone who's been waiting his whole life to pick them up.